Hi, very beautiful community. Let's talk about the big White House gathering yesterday. And rather than sort of come into having at the back of my mind 3 or 4 points I want to make, I just want to have a heart to heart with you about it, because in a way, you are already conscious of most of the important points that need to be made about it, because quite frankly, you follow the news, you follow a lot of good commentators. Not everything is bad. Zelensky has more cards than he did back in the calamitous February meeting. The Europeans are committing to spending more on defense, even though that's going to come at a certain kind of self-undermining cost. That's to say, the more you spend on defense, the less you're going to invest in the welfare state, the more you will accelerate the crisis of trust, the more you're going to elect pro-Russian authoritarian populists, which means that it won't matter that much that you've increased your defense spending. But that's happening. The quality of dialogue between the Trump administration and centers of power in major European countries has clearly improved. That seems to be the private sentiment behind the scenes. I think we can also see evidence of that. So that's better. And the project is to inflect Trump, the project of the European leaders, into a more pro-Ukraine position and into a position of better perceiving that lots of things that Putin could hypothetically do that he's refusing to do, and that therefore more pressure needs to be exerted on him. But despite these positives, the main takeaway I felt worth sharing with you from the event is a kind of sense of Western decline. Because there we have Trump, incapable of tactical or strategic or even belief-based consistency, in a completely ludicrously embarrassing narcissistic marriage with Putin. In a certain sense, Putin was in the room with the European leaders because of Trump's respect for the magical notion he has of their relationship. And Trump is also attacking US institutions and attacking US state capacity, which means that a less destructive and less vandalistic leader in the future will not have the foundation to act with strategic seriousness, even if they want to. So that's the orange wrecking ball. And then around the table, we have European leaders who look humiliatingly submissive. And they are humiliated by it. I mean, they just know you have to eat shit and get things done. But it looks really bad, and it really undermines trust. You've got European leaders who are not prepared to raise the crucial issues that really matter, because the key aim of that meeting was to keep the show on the road and to prevent it from becoming a car crash. The key aim was not to robustly and directly address the main issues, because the European leaders judged, as it happens correctly, Trump's not capable of that. So Putin's demand for the rest of the Donetsk wasn't discussed. Security guarantees were discussed, but in a magical thinking sort of way. European leaders talked about security guarantees without being clear about what they're actually capable and able to do. And without the understanding that it's only, well, with the understanding, but without the follow-through on the truth that it's only if you are serious about security guarantees that Putin's going to take your security guarantees seriously. Security guarantees mean deterrence of Putin's Russia, but it also means clarity about the consequences. And we are discussing Article 5 like security guarantees for Ukraine, to use the quote that's doing the rounds, at a time when Article 5, or at least Article 5's sort of strongest interpretations, are themselves melting down. Right? The United States will not be there to defend the Baltics 5 years from now if they need defending, in all likelihood. Now, so the conversation about security guarantees was rather magical. And as were the mentions of ceasefire. Merz immediately said, well, let's not take ceasefire off the table. But he knows that Putin isn't going to do a ceasefire unless he gets something very big in exchange, because it's advantageous to Putin to carry on the war while negotiations are taking place. And then he can use negotiations for whatever purpose. For instance, the purpose of, in fact, getting him closer to winning the war. But that's mentioned not because it's wanted by European leaders for Trump to pressure Putin into a ceasefire, as much as it's wanted by European leaders to put Trump in a place where he understands, perhaps more clearly than he does so far, that Putin is not yielding to something that he could yield to. And so how do we get Trump to be more critical of Putin was a big part of the aspiration there. And so there's a kind of a post-truth quality to the whole discourse. And you can't entirely blame European leaders for it because they are responding to Trump. But what's happened is that in the way they're interacting with Trump, the post-truth politician, they themselves become post-truth politicians because they need to say the sorts of things that are going to work on him. But that's extremely damaging. You can do that. There is a benefit to it, but it's extremely damaging because it just makes politics look like farce. And as a result, it's not a surprise that much of the reporting on the event has been utterly trivial. You know, here are Meloni's eyeballs, and this is how far they rolled to the left, and this is how far they rolled to the right, and this is when she looks exasperated, and this is when Keir Starmer is looking at the ceiling, and this is what the body language of these people is when they're in the corridor. So it's really politics as soap opera. And the trouble with that, it makes it all look ultimately unreal. And in an age where politics feels very dangerously unreal to voters who are aggressively voting to break the system because it feels so unreal to them, this is a problem. It is, however, partly a commentary on the quality of the European leaders. A very, very, very harsh commentary, but a commentary. Why do I say harsh? Because the job of a leader of a major European country today is about 11 times harder than it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. You're much more in a situation where you're sitting behind the wheels of a vehicle. You're turning the steering wheel, nothing happens. You're changing the gear, not much happens. You're pressing the pedal, a little bit happens, but not much. When you kick the accelerator and kick the brake, something happens, but not much. And that's all. But you have to pretend that this thing kind of works. And so you say, well, yes, I'm at the wheel, I'm going like that, and it's going great. But people are seeing that it's not going great. And a lot of people are seeing that it's not going great, are participating still in this facade. Oh yes, they're turning the wheel very, very well, and that's why I'm going to vote for them. And the politicians sitting there thinking, well, I don't know, this is not working. Well, let's say that it is, and maybe if I say that it is, it'll kind of work a little more than it does at least. So there's a kind of a co-conspiracy around the efficacy of control over a vehicle that seems to be difficult to control at all. And it doesn't mean that you can't work effectively under these conditions as a politician. But what it means is that to respond to these conditions without just passivity and without just trying to get through, just about keep the show on the road, to keep the perception of the show being on the road going. Responding to this situation in a way that goes beyond just getting by now takes extraordinary political talent, political courage that can't be reasonably expected of a sound political operator like Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK. Right? He just cannot handle the age. Be a good cabinet minister, but he can't handle it as Prime Minister. But very few people could, because the demands are now so extreme. Winning is really hard responsibly today. It's possible, but it's really hard. But then governing effectively and talking with the citizenry about how you're governing and why you're doing what you're doing, all of that is extraordinarily difficult today. It would take a politician of extraordinary rather than unique vision and capacity and talent for improvisatory action to transcend this standard mode we're seeing of defensiveness. That transcendence for European leaders would look like challenging Trump much more. But it feels very, very scary, but it would look like challenging Trump much more. And it's a kind of a double feeling that many European leaders have about Trump, which is that he's an aberration, and so we have to just get through the Trump period. We have to make do. We have to eat shit. We have to, not roll our eyes too much. Just get through it. But the second disposition says, no, it's actually worse than that. We're cooked. Trump is the politics now. And so challenging him too aggressively is actually going to be challenging the form of politics that's now inevitably taking over. And so it's not going to work. And so there is a kind of a double reaction, which is an underestimation of Trumpism. Oh, it's an aberration, it'll pass. And an overestimation. Well, this is now everywhere. This is now the way things are going to be done. And so I'm not going to challenge it. Trump is stronger than the underestimation suggests. Trumpism is stronger. We are in an age of democratic decline, and our default politics is authoritarian right populism in most Western countries. But there is actually a way to challenge irresponsible post-truth populism without just reproducing the technocratic centrism that's currently its main challenger. There is a way to do it. It's complex. It requires drawing from different places on the ideological spectrum. And it requires an amazing communicative balance of populism and constitutionalism, being able to engage in, speech that impacts private sentiment, but at the same time also respecting institutions. So the underestimation of Trump is an underestimation of Trump, and the overestimation of Trump is an overestimation of Trump, and you've got both working in the heads of these European leaders. But the rough project that they're engaged in is a mistake. It's an illusion. The project is that you inflect Trump's position on Ukraine. There are many problems with that, but there are two central problems. One is that Trump's position doesn't evolve. it sort of bobs along under the obtaining weather conditions, and as the weather conditions rotate or change, it just goes round in circles with them. It does not progress much. So the idea that you're going to get Trump somewhere over a course of weeks without him relapsing to where he started is very, very ambitious, to put it mildly. But there is also a second point about which I hope to speak in more depth with you, and that's that Trump's the enemy to some degree. You can't quite treat him as an enemy if you're in domestic US politics. He's your political opponent. But there is a sense in which Trump is the enemy ideologically. Trump is not an erratic, pro-democratic politician with some authoritarian tendencies who you kind of want to stabilize and keep on board. He is an organic development of Putinism in the West. So there's something bizarre about trying to ally with Trump against Putin. You are using Putinism to some degree to ally against Putinism that way. It won't work in the medium term. And it's partly sort of partial consciousness of all of this that's making European leaders so rigid and defensive. They understand that Trumpism is brewing under their feet too. The trouble is the passivity of their approach with Trump, the submissiveness of their approach with Trump, is actually only going to accelerate in Trumpism in their countries, and going to accelerate these very leaders being domestically replaced by local Trumps. So it's self-undermining. So I think that's some of how I see the waters we're in. Difficult waters where, the tools that our political representatives need to use to fix the troubles we face are melting down in their grasp, which is a difficult situation. It's not a situation in which we give up hope, but it is a situation in which we know that for a while it's going to be institutional resilience that keeps our democracies on the road. And beyond that, it's going to be a much more aggressive, much more bold, much more proactive domestic politics that keeps authoritarians out of power in our home countries, but also allows us to act with a modicum of strategic capacity on the international stage. We need to respond with incomparably greater boldness to the crisis we face. Lots of love and talk very soon.